premise of our case, as my partner stated in his last speech, is that military commissions fail the standard of justice. They do not provide due punishment in due time. I'll be looking at 3 reasons why we believe that the affirmative team's case is warranted in today's debate. First, looking at the disadvantages of military commissions, then looking at the advantages of federal courts, and then looking at the value of justice. So let's begin by looking at the disadvantages of using military commissions. Now, in their last speech, Noah began his speech by talking about how we should instead reform military commissions instead of abolishing them. Now, my first response to this is its new argument. Now, this is the rebuttals. They're supposed to be refuting arguments, not providing you ideas in today's debate, like arguing for reform instead of completely maintaining military commissions altogether. Now, secondly, if we vote for the status quo is not acceptable. Status quo is not acceptable. If you vote for the negative team, you receive the status quo, not a reform towards military commissions. And thus, they agree with the 24 experts that we talked about, how military commissions, as they stand, do not promote justice, and it's in the interest of the United States to actually reform military commissions. Now, secondly, they argued, well, it's actually not that bad that military commissions aren't working because terrorists aren't running free. They're sitting in Guantanamo Bay as we speak. Now, my response to this is injustice. They have not received due punishment in due time through a trial in courts. Now, the only defense that the negative team has for the status quo of allowing terrorists to sit in Guantanamo Bay is that at least they're not running free right now, and that they're not free and escaping punishment. But this is still an injustice, seeing that we have not convicted 9/11 terrorists after 19 years. Terrorists who have committed one of the worst terrorist attacks in United States history. Now, my second response has to do with the 360 number that's been tossed around back and forth by both the affirmative and negative team. Now, they argue that Tier 1 trials are not comparable to the trials within military commissions. Now, my first response to this is speculation. They never actually stated how these were not comparable to military commission trials and never actually expounded on that evidence properly. Now, secondly, this is a precedent of success. We have seen how federal courts can accurately and effectively try terrorists on high-level charges, at the very least in a dozen cases, and at the most in 360 different cases. And so this is a point in favor of using federal courts and in favor of upholding justice. Now, secondly, they argued about the evidence standards, and I like to address this in my second voting issue, that of the advantages of federal courts. Now, they argued, well, actually, the standard of Classified Information Procedures Act is harmful, and federal courts are the only ones that use that. And they cited our evidence and argued it only stated that federal courts use this. Now, my first response to this idea is that both apply to CIPA, or the Classified Information Procedures Act. Now, specifically within our evidence from David Glazier, it states, commission's rules for classified evidence are based on the Classified Information Procedures Act that have been applied in Article 3 courts in dozens of terrorism cases since 9/11. And so specifically, when we look at this situation, we can see that CIPA applies to both cases. Now, my second response is outdated evidence. The examples that they read of terrorists receiving classified information came from the 1990s, the bombing of the World Trade Center. Now, this evidence specifically states that since 9/11, CIPA has been applied to terrorism cases. And so we can see that as something that may have happened in the 1990s is not going to happen today. Now, I'd also like to look at the idea that we lose intelligence, the second voting issue of the negative team. Now, my first response to this idea is no advantage in military commissions. The negative team has yet to prove how using military commissions would actually benefit the United States. My second response is speculation, not specifics. The negative team said, well, potentially there's a harm that our allies might feel afraid of using classified information or sharing it with the United States when terrorists are tried in federal courts. But this was simply a speculation. They also argued about the problems with terrorists in prisons and stated that, well, they could cause terrorism in prisons and actually attack prison guards and radicalize other prisoners. Now, my first response to this is prison safety. Once again, we stated that terrorists have never escaped from prisons in the United States. We ensure national security in this respect. Now, secondly, this is a non-unique disadvantage, something that my partner touched on a little bit earlier. This has happened in the status quo, and unfortunately, our plan does nothing to change that. This is not a disadvantage to the status quo. If at the very least, it is a disadvantage of the status quo as well, as the affirmative team's case. Now, third, let's examine the value of justice. Now, we've talked about in our speech the advantages of federal courts to justice, and this is something that we continue to stand by. For instance, international cooperation, something never responded to by the the negative team, still stands in today's debate, allowing extradition of criminals from other countries to the United States through the use of federal courts. Now, secondly, we also ensure, most importantly, justice. We showed how 32 charges are only available in the military commissions compared to the 4,000 in federal courts. This is, again, one example of how effective federal courts are in ensuring justice, and we believe it warrants an affirmative